Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now a couple of videos ago I picked up this, an old dual Xeon workstation with 8 cores for just £25 or $30. Costing over $5,000 a decade ago, the 2 gigs of RAM and DX10 limited FX4600 graphics card were two components seriously showing their age. But the two quad-core E5450s are still decent budget CPU choices today, especially if you can find them as part of a cheap setup like this. Since the original video I've made a couple of upgrades to this thing, all while trying to stick to a later decided £100 budget. At some point in the future I'll be upgrading it even further to see what could be achieved when we go completely all out, but here's what I've done to transform this super cheap workstation into a budget gaming PC. As you may recall, this machine came with a stock 650 watt PSU, though it only had one 6-pin connector. It still seemed a waste to replace it with all that untapped power under the hood, so I went in search of a graphics card that I could find at a reasonable price, and one that would only need a sensible amount of wattage to run, safely. I therefore ended up with this, the Gigabyte ITX GTX 960. This Maxwell based card sits between a 1050 and 1050 Ti performance wise, but cost me less than both, half in fact than the latter. Here in the UK I always compare the deals I find on hardware to the prices over at CEX, as they seem to be among the cheapest for used parts, so I think I did okay here, especially for a buy it now item. The next problem I had to deal with was that 2 GB of RAM. I had no compatible memory at the time of making the last video, so I took to eBay as usual and managed to find some cheap Dell memory that I was ensured was compatible. At first I thought about just buying two 4GB sticks, but why stop there when 16GB seems so reasonably priced? It's not often I stick 16GB in a budget PC, but with this being a workstation, I'd like to continue using it like one as well, so for editing and content creation, the more RAM the better. Although unrelated to the performance, I also think the baby blue heat spreaders look good too. So with a total spend of £110 or $145 on this setup, still a saving of $4,800 or so on the original price tag, it was time to see what difference my lowest cost upgrades would make to this thing's gaming performance. So let's get into it. I tried to target a 60 FPS at 1080p experience with this system, or as close as I could get by lowering the settings as required, though that wasn't always the case, as you'll later see. First up, in Battlefield 1, this workstation turned gaming PC managed 59 FPS on average, with fairly respectable 1% and 0.1% lows as well. These figures reflect a pretty solid performance, relatively free of stutter and slowdown. Turning things down to low meant a slight increase in performance, and high settings impacted the frame rate a little, though not by a significant reduction, but medium in my opinion creates a nice blend of graphical quality and performance. Next up I took to a more modern Battlefield in a slightly older game, Battlefield 3. Although it's a few years old now, it remains a very good game and graphically intensive one for older or more budget orientated hardware, but nonetheless I cranked everything up to ultra and saw a nice 82 frames per second on average during this action-packed opening level. Next up I took to CSGO. The footage here was taken from a bot match, though the figures were taken from an online game with things set to high. Some people say that playing on low is ideal due to the competitive nature of this game, allowing for even higher frame rates to be achieved, but for those of us happy with 60, this game exceeds that target on any map with these settings. Dirt 4 at high, just like Battlefield 1, was shy of a 60 frames per second average at the high settings here, and MSAA turned off. Single races will differ performance-wise to multi-competitor events, so bear that in mind, though the figures here were taken from combining different races to try and give you the best idea of performance. Moving on to a couple more demanding titles, and Ghost Recon Wildlands ran the best on low. It's also worth mentioning the graphics card's VRAM was exceeded even at these settings. That may be worth bearing in mind with regards to certain titles, but we still saw a playable average of 45 frames per second. Lowering the resolution would also help a bit with that frame rate, and even at medium settings the game stayed at a pretty solid 30 FPS, so if 30 is fine for you, then you could turn things up a little on a system like this one. Now I say this every time, but PUBG is far better than it used to be performance wise, and runs better on a wider array of hardware now. The dual Xeons and 2GB 960 had no trouble here at low settings, though the frame rate did start off at about 40 when I first landed, before the environment around me had a chance to fully load. Resident Evil 7 was probably the easiest to run title today, soaring way over 100 FPS during this opening level. Of course this will vary depending on where you are in the house and who or what is chasing you, but because the environments are all very similar here, you will still see a very playable experience at medium. I could have turned things up for that matter to high or even the highest settings. In contrast to Resident Evil, Watch Dogs 2 was probably the poorest performing game today, averaging just 30 frames per second at low. These figures were taken from within the busy San Francisco cityscape and will vary the more you venture towards the coast, but I still saw a few performance hiccups throughout my half an hour playtime. Finally, I played the first 15 minutes of the opening level of Wolfenstein 2 and saw a 55 FPS average on low settings at Full HD. I imagine this figure will change quite significantly depending on the level, but I had a decent experience during the time I played it. I've never played this before and that dog scene messed me up, so thank you Simon, who suggested I add this game to my library. Of course, I couldn't resist trying out video editing either, and as an old workstation it would be a shame to deny this thing its natural habitat. In Premiere Pro, the machine performed flawlessly. Editing felt fast and snappy, video playback was smooth, and rendering times were fairly respectable. It's amazing that after 11 years a dual Xeon 771 socket config like this can still make light work of content creation, not to mention the upgrades that can be made for gaming. The processors still weren't bottlenecking a 960 either, so you could definitely pair something more powerful with them, as I plan to test out soon. As for this video though, I hope you guys have enjoyed it, and I hope you've enjoyed what I've done so far with this old HP workstation. If you like this video, be sure to leave a like down below. If you didn't like this video, leave a dislike on it down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.